2 days before the wedding, my fiancé's wealthy parents handed me a prenup, grinning as if they'd already claimed victory. Little did they know I had $7 million, a sharp lawyer, and a master plan that would erase those conceited smiles for good. Sign here, here, and initial here. Rebecca Reynolds placed the gold-plated pen on my kitchen counter with the precision of someone laying down a winning poker hand. 2 days. That's all the time left before I was supposed to marry her son Brandon, and she'd chosen this exact moment, 7:47 p.m. on a Thursday, to arrive unannounced at my apartment with her husband Samuel and a 30-page prenuptial agreement. Brandon was mysteriously unreachable, tied up in urgent depositions that I now suspected were as fabricated as Rebecca's smile. She watched me scan the document's opening paragraphs, her manicured fingers drumming once against her Prada clutch, savoring what she assumed would be my complete surrender. The agreement wasn't just unfair. It was designed to financially erase me from any future I might build with Brandon. What Rebecca didn't know, what she'd never bothered to investigate during 3 years of treating me like a charity case her son had picked up, was that I had $7 million in inherited wealth, a thriving technology company, and Harold Winters, Chicago's most ruthless attorney, on speed dial. My hands remained steady as I turned each page, though inside, my mind raced back to 5 years ago when this hidden fortune had become mine. Grandma Rose had lived in the same modest Evanston bungalow for 40 years, growing tomatoes in her backyard and mending clothes rather than buying new ones. When Harold Winters had called me to his office after her funeral, I'd expected maybe a few $1,000s and some family jewelry. Instead, he'd pushed a portfolio across his mahogany desk that made me question reality itself. $7 million accumulated through decades of patient investing, disguised behind thrift store clothing and coupon clipping. Your grandmother started investing in 1962 with $200 from selling her engagement ring after your grandfather died, Harold had explained, his voice carrying deep respect. She studied the market like other people study scripture. Every dividend reinvested, every opportunity carefully analyzed. She lived like she had nothing because she wanted you to have everything, but more importantly, she wanted you to have freedom. I'd walked out of that office and returned to my life as if nothing had changed. My Honda Civic still had the dent in the bumper from a parking mishap. My one-bedroom apartment near Wicker Park still needed the bathroom faucet jiggled just right to stop dripping. My educational software company still operated from a cramped office space with second-hand furniture. Only my sister Sarah knew the truth, and even she'd needed to see the statements 3 times before believing it. The money had become my secret compass, guiding decisions without anyone knowing it existed. It let me turn down venture capital offers that would have given away control of my company. It let me choose relationships based on genuine connection rather than financial necessity. Most importantly, it let me see who people really were when they thought I had nothing to offer except myself. That philosophy had led me to the Palmer Foundation Gala 3 years ago. My company had donated adaptive learning software to their literacy program, and attending the fundraiser was part of the partnership. I'd been standing near the silent auction table, marveling at someone's audacity to ask $30,000 for what looked like anger expressed in acrylic paint, when Brandon Reynolds had appeared beside me. "I've been staring at that piece for 10 minutes, he'd said, tilting his head at the canvas. "Either I'm missing something profound, or we're all pretending the emperor has clothes." His honesty in that room full of pretension had caught me off guard. We'd spent the next 2 hours by that auction table, him asking genuinely interested questions about how my software adapted to different learning styles, me surprised to find a trust fund heir who actually understood algorithmic education. He hadn't once mentioned his family's law firm or their real estate holdings. He'd simply been Brandon, a man curious about technology that could help kids learn. Our relationship had grown slowly, organically. Coffee became lunch, became dinner, became entire weekends exploring Chicago's neighborhoods. He'd never suggested restaurants I couldn't afford, never assumed I'd drop everything for his schedule, never once made me feel like someone from the wrong side of the economic divide he'd crossed to be with me. 3 years of Saturday mornings at the Green City Farmers Market, where he'd carry my overambitious vegetable purchases without complaint. 3 years of cooking experiments in my tiny kitchen that triggered smoke alarms and resulted in takeout orders. 3 years of debates that ranged from serious discussions about education inequality to passionate arguments about whether Chicago deep dish was actually pizza or casserole masquerading as pizza. Neither of us had talked about money. He didn't flaunt his family's wealth. I didn't reveal mine. We existed in this bubble where connection mattered more than bank balances, where his family name was just letters on a doorbell, where my background was irrelevant compared to our future. The proposal had come at our favorite spot in Lincoln Park, overlooking Lake Michigan as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. He'd pulled out his grandmother's Art Deco ring, not some massive diamond designed to impress, but a subtle emerald surrounded by seed pearls that had weathered 70 years of marriage. "I know you could build an incredible life with or without me," he'd said, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm just hoping you'll choose to build it with me." The wedding planning had started with pure intentions. We'd wanted something elegant but intimate, maybe 60 people, focused on celebration rather than spectacle. We'd picked a date, chosen a small venue, started a simple guest list. Then Rebecca Reynolds had descended like a storm system. "Darling," she'd said at our first planning lunch, though the endearment felt sharp rather than warm, "the Reynolds family has certain expectations. Our circle will be watching. This wedding reflects not just on you and Brandon, but on generations of family legacy." Each meeting had brought new invasions. The guest list swelled to 200. The simple venue became the Drake Hotel's grand ballroom. My dress selection was deemed quaint and overruled. The flowers I'd chosen were pedestrian. The cake was uninspired. Brandon had tried to mediate, but I'd watched him shrink in his mother's presence, reverting to the boy who'd learned that resistance meant exhaustion. Now, standing in my kitchen with their prenuptial grenade ticking on my counter, I understood that the wedding had always been a prelude to this moment. Every dismissive comment about my choices, every assumption about my inability to afford their standards, every subtle reminder of their generosity, it had all been preparation for this ambush. Samuel cleared his throat, impatient. "We need this resolved tonight, Alara. The wedding is in 2 days." I looked up from the document, meeting Rebecca's expectant gaze. They thought they'd cornered me. Too late to cancel without humiliation, too close to negotiate fairly, too sudden to refuse without seeming like the gold digger they'd already decided I was. What they hadn't counted on was Grandma Rose's true gift, not just the money but the lesson that came with it. Real power isn't what you display, it's what you hold in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. I set the prenuptial agreement down carefully, my fingers lingering on the thick paper. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller with Samuel and Rebecca Reynolds standing in it, their presence filling my modest space with an oppressive weight. I needed time to think, to process what they were demanding, but Rebecca was already tapping her manicured nails against her clutch, impatient for my compliance. The morning after Brandon had proposed, everything had shifted. I'd barely finished my coffee when my phone rang at 7 a.m. Rebecca's voice had been honey-sweet, but there was steel underneath. "Darling, we simply must discuss venues. I've taken the liberty of scheduling appointments at the Fairmont and the Peninsula. Both have availability for next June." I'd mentioned the Chicago Botanic Garden, the place where Brandon and I had spent countless Sunday afternoons, where he'd first told me he loved me near the Japanese garden. Rebecca's laugh had been short and dismissive. "Oh, that's charming really, but hardly appropriate for our circle. The Reynolds name carries certain expectations. An outdoor venue? What if it rains? What would Senator Morrison think? Or Judge Kellerman?" That first conversation had set the pattern. Every suggestion I made was met with gentle condescension, every preference dismissed as naive or unsuitable. When I'd driven to their Lake Forest estate to discuss wedding plans, Rebecca's eyes had swept over my Honda Civic with barely concealed disdain. Inside their home, she'd studied me like an anthropologist examining a foreign species, noting my Target dress, my department store shoes, the way I hesitated before choosing the correct fork at dinner. 3 months into our engagement, Samuel had finally shown his hand. He'd invited Brandon and me to dinner at his private club, the kind of place where membership was inherited rather than earned. The dark wood paneling and leather chairs reeked of old money and older prejudices. Between the soup course and the fish, Samuel had begun his interrogation. "So, Alara, this software company of yours, what are your profit margins?" He'd asked it casually as if discussing the weather, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "We're doing well," I'd replied carefully. "We've been profitable for 2 years. Actual numbers, dear. In business we deal in specifics." His tone suggested he doubted I understood real business at all. Our margins are healthy for the education technology sector. I deflected, uncomfortable with his probing. He'd moved on to my parents. Both teachers, Brandon tells me. Public school. Yes. My mother teaches 3rd grade, my father high school history. Admirable profession, Samuel had said in a tone that suggested the opposite. Though I imagine the financial constraints were challenging growing up. Student loans must be substantial. Brandon had shifted uncomfortably beside me, his hand finding mine under the table. Dad, I don't think. Just getting to know your fiancé better, son. Surely that's natural. Samuel had continued his questioning through 3 courses, extracting information about my apartment rent, my car payments, even my credit score through cleverly disguised questions. I'd deflected what I could, but he was skilled at this kind of extraction. What I hadn't told him was that my student loans had been paid off the day after I'd inherited Grandma Rose's money. That my credit score was pristine. That I could have bought a house in cash but chose to rent because I valued flexibility over property status. He'd been building a profile of me as a struggling entrepreneur from a modest background, someone who needed the Reynolds family more than they needed me. The guest list battle had been the most revealing. Brandon and I had made our list together. 60 people who actually mattered to us. My college friends, his law school buddies, our families, the colleagues who'd become friends. Rebecca had taken one look and pulled out her own list. I've taken the liberty of adding a few names, she'd said, handing me 3 typed pages. 70 additional names, none of whom I recognized. Rebecca, I don't know any of these people. Well, of course you don't, dear. They're Samuel's business associates, our club members, people who expect invitations to Reynolds family events. Your little company friends are charming, I'm sure, but this wedding requires a certain caliber of attendee. The way she'd said little company friends had made my teeth clench. These were brilliant programmers, dedicated teachers, innovative thinkers who were changing education technology. But to Rebecca, they were nobody because they didn't summer in the Hamptons or have buildings named after their families. Perhaps we could compromise, I'd suggested. Add 20 of your must-haves? Her smile had been razor-sharp. Alara, you need to understand something. When you marry Brandon, you're not just marrying him. You're marrying into the Reynolds family. Our reputation, our connections, our standing, they all become yours. But that privilege comes with responsibilities. Brandon had tried to intervene, but Rebecca had shut him down with a look I'd seen her deploy before. The one that reminded him who controlled the trust fund, who held the family purse strings, who could make his life comfortable or complicated. It was during my wedding dress fitting that Sarah finally said what I'd been trying not to think. Rebecca had insisted on coming, though I'd only invited my sister and my best friend Mia. She'd walked around me as I stood on the platform, examining the elegant sheath dress I'd chosen. It's very simple, she'd pronounced. Don't you think a Reynolds bride should make more of a statement? I know a designer who could create something more suitable. After she'd left, Sarah had pulled me aside at the coffee shop next door. Her expression was serious in a way that made my stomach drop. Alara, I need to say something and you might not want to hear it. Sarah. No, listen. I've been watching this for months now. Rebecca is establishing dominance. Every criticism, every suggestion, every time she overrides your choices, she's training you to submit. She's testing how much you'll bend before you break. I'd wanted to protest, to say she was overreacting, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down I knew she was right. I've seen this before, Sarah had continued. My friend from college, remember Julia? Her in-laws did the same thing. Started with wedding planning, then it was where they lived, how they raised their kids, every major decision. By the time she realized what was happening, she'd lost herself completely. Brandon's not like that, I'd said, but even I heard the uncertainty in my voice. Maybe not. But he's not standing up to them either, is he? When Rebecca dismisses your choices, where is he? When Samuel interrogates you like you're applying for a job, what does Brandon do? She'd been right and I'd known it even then. Brandon would hold my hand under the table, would apologize privately later, would promise things would be different after the wedding. But when it mattered, when his parents were actively diminishing me, he'd shrink back into the compliant son they'd raised. Sarah had grabbed my hand across the table. You're brilliant, Alara. You built a company from nothing. You don't need their approval or their money or their connections. Please be careful. Please remember who you are. Now, standing in my kitchen with Samuel checking his watch and Rebecca's satisfied smile growing wider with each second of my silence, I remembered Sarah's warning. They'd been building to this moment for months, each small surrender preparing me for this ultimate capitulation. They'd profiled me, categorized me, and decided I was someone they could control. They had no idea how wrong they were. I looked up from the counter where the prenuptial agreement lay like a declaration of war. Rebecca's perfectly painted lips curved into a wider smile as she watched me process what they were demanding. Samuel had moved closer, creating a subtle semicircle that made my small kitchen feel like a trap. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, but I kept my expression neutral, drawing on every lesson Grandma Rose had taught me about never showing your cards too early. I need to read this thoroughly, I said, picking up the document with steady hands despite the rage building inside me. Surely you understand the importance of reviewing legal documents carefully. Rebecca's laugh was light and poisonous. There's really nothing complex about it, dear. Standard protections that any family of means would require. I signed something similar when I married Samuel 32 years ago. But as I flipped through the pages, my trained eye caught details that made my stomach turn. This wasn't protection. It was complete financial annihilation disguised in legal terminology. The document specified that any assets acquired during marriage would remain solely Brandon's property. Any business ventures I started or expanded would potentially fall under marital enterprise clauses that could give the Reynolds family claim to my intellectual property. There was even a clause about social media presence and public representation that would essentially require me to get approval before making any public statements that could impact the Reynolds family reputation. This clause here, I said, pointing to a particularly egregious section, suggests that any technology or educational materials I develop during our marriage could be subject to Reynolds family oversight. That affects my existing company. Samuel waved his hand dismissively. Only if those developments use marital resources or time. Surely you don't plan to neglect your marriage for your little hobby business. The condescension in his voice when he said, hobby business, made me want to throw the document in his face. My company had contracts with 12 school districts and had helped over 10,000 students improve their reading levels. But to him, it was a hobby because it didn't generate the kind of wealth he recognized as legitimate. I'll need my attorney to review this, I said firmly, closing the document. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rebecca's smile vanished, replaced by something cold and sharp. That won't be necessary. We need this signed tonight. Tonight? The wedding is in 2 days. Precisely why this needs to be handled immediately, Samuel said, his tone shifting from dismissive to threatening. We've invested considerable resources in this wedding. The Drake Hotel, the flowers, the catering, $90,000 to be exact. But we're prepared to cancel everything if necessary. The number was meant to intimidate me, to make me feel guilty about the money they'd spent. What they didn't know was that $90,000 was less than my investment portfolio earned in a good quarter. You're giving me an ultimatum? I asked, wanting absolute clarity on what was happening. Rebecca pulled out a Mont Blanc pen from her purse, setting it on the counter next to the document with theatrical precision. We're giving you a choice. Sign the agreement now, or we'll call the Drake Hotel within the hour and cancel everything. You can explain to 200 guests why the wedding is off. And Brandon? What does he say about this? Samuel and Rebecca exchanged a quick glance that told me everything I needed to know. Brandon understands family obligations, Samuel said carefully. He knows that protecting the Reynolds legacy is paramount. So he knows you're here, presenting me with this ultimatum 2 days before our wedding? Brandon is in depositions, Rebecca said smoothly. Too smoothly. This couldn't wait for his schedule. I pulled out my phone. Then you won't mind if I call him. He can't be disturbed during depositions, Samuel said quickly. You know how these legal matters are. I dialed anyway. The phone rang once before going to voicemail. Someone had declined the call. I tried again. Same result. On the third try, Brandon's assistant answered. Hi, Jennifer. I need to speak with Brandon urgently. I'm sorry, Ms. Vance, but Mr. Reynolds is in depositions and can't be disturbed. Behind Jennifer's professional voice, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The distinct sound of restaurant ambience. Clinking glasses, muffled conversation, someone laughing. Brandon wasn't in depositions. He was having lunch somewhere while his parents ambushed me in my own home. "Thank you, Jennifer," I said, ending the call. I looked at Samuel and Rebecca really looked at them. They stood in my kitchen like conquerors surveying captured territory, absolutely certain of their victory. They'd orchestrated this entire ambush. The timing, Brandon's absence, the pressure of the approaching wedding. They'd profiled me as someone without resources, without options, without power. Someone who would crumble when faced with the potential humiliation of a cancelled wedding. "You need to leave," I said quietly. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me. Get out of my apartment. Now." Samuel's face flushed red. "Now listen here, young lady." "No, you listen." I picked up the prenuptial agreement and held it between us. "You came into my home uninvited, attempted to coerce me into signing away my rights, and you did it while ensuring your son couldn't interfere. This isn't a negotiation. It's an ambush. And I don't respond well to ambushes. If you don't sign this tonight, there will be no wedding," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Then that's a decision you're making," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded when inside I was screaming. "You're choosing to cancel your son's wedding because I won't sign away my future without legal counsel. Explain that to your 200 guests." Rebecca stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming in my small space. "You're making a terrible mistake. Do you really think Brandon will choose you over his family? Over his inheritance? Over everything he's known his entire life?" The question hung in the air like a blade. It was the same question I'd been avoiding for months, the one that whispered in quiet moments when Brandon failed to defend me against his mother's subtle cruelties or his father's dismissive comments. "I guess we'll find out," I said, meeting her gaze steadily. Samuel picked up the pen Rebecca had placed on the counter, holding it out to me one more time. "Last chance, Alara. Sign it now, have your fairy tale wedding and everyone's happy. Refuse, and by tomorrow morning, every person on that guest list will know that you refused to sign a simple prenuptial agreement. What do you think they'll assume about your motives?" It was masterfully played, threatening not just the wedding but my reputation. In their world, refusing a prenup would mark me as exactly the gold digger they'd always suspected I was. They expected me to crumble under the weight of that potential shame. Instead, I walked to my door and opened it. "Get out." They left, but Rebecca turned at the threshold. "You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow. If we don't have your signature by then, I'll personally call every guest and vendor. And Alara, when Brandon has to choose between you and everything else, remember that you forced this choice." The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything I'd built with Brandon. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Then I walked to my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. Harold Winters answered on the second ring. "Alara, what a pleasant surprise." "Harold, I need you. Tonight." The Reynolds family just tried to ambush me with a prenuptial agreement 2 days before my wedding. There was a pause, then Harold's voice turned sharp as a blade. "I'll be there in an hour. And Alara, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And document everything you remember about this conversation while it's fresh." I hung up with Harold and immediately opened my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I documented every detail of the Reynolds ambush while their words still burned fresh in my memory. The way Rebecca had smiled while watching me read their financial death sentence. Samuel's dismissive tone when he called my company a hobby. The calculated timing of Brandon's absence. Every detail mattered now. 45 minutes later, Harold Winters stood in my doorway, his weathered briefcase in one hand and a legal pad in the other. At 73, he moved with the purposeful energy of someone who had spent 5 decades dismantling corporate bullies and predatory contracts. His gray suit was impeccable despite the late hour, his silver hair perfectly combed as always. "Show me the document," he said without preamble, settling at my dining table and pulling out his reading glasses. I handed him the prenuptial agreement, then poured us both coffee while he read. The only sounds in my apartment were the rustling of pages and the occasional sharp intake of breath as Harold encountered particularly egregious clauses. His expression grew darker with each page, the furrows in his brow deepening. After 20 minutes, he set down the document and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "In 47 years of legal practice, I've seen some predatory agreements. This isn't just predatory, It's financial imprisonment wrapped in legal language. Can they enforce it if I sign? Oh, it would be legally binding, though some clauses might not hold up under scrutiny. But that's not the point. The point is they're not trying to protect assets, they're establishing ownership. Look at this intellectual property clause. Any educational technology you develop during marriage could be claimed as marital property subject to Reynolds' family interest. Your existing company could be compromised. Harold pulled out his legal pad and began making notes in his precise handwriting. They've made a critical error, though. They've shown their hand too early and too aggressively. Now tell me about your financial situation. Every detail. I retrieved my files from the bedroom safe, investment statements, the company valuation from our last funding round, property documents for the 2 rental properties I'd purchased with part of Grandma's inheritance. Harold reviewed each document methodically, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. $7.3 million in liquid assets and investments, he summarized. Another $1.5 million in company valuation, though that's less liquid. Real estate worth approximately $800,000. Total net worth approaching $10 million. He looked up at me over his glasses. And the Reynolds family has no knowledge of this? None. I've been very careful. My credit cards are modest limit. I drive a Honda. I live here. I gestured at my 1-bedroom apartment. Even Brandon only knows I run a small tech company. Harold leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. They've severely miscalculated. Now we craft our response. Not just a counteroffer, but a complete reversal of their attempted power play. We worked side by side, Harold drafting language while I provided financial details and context about the business. The new prenuptial agreement we created was everything theirs wasn't: balanced, fair, protective of both parties' assets and future earnings. It included provisions for my intellectual property that would prevent any claim on my company or its developments. It specified that inherited assets would remain separate property. It even included clauses about family business interference, something Harold added with particular satisfaction. This section here, he pointed to a paragraph near the end, prevents either party's family from exerting undue influence on marital decisions. If they want to play the prenuptial game, we'll make sure it cuts both ways. By 11:30 we had a complete document. Harold had called in a favor to have it professionally formatted and bound, a courier arriving just before midnight to deliver the finished product. It looked every bit as official and imposing as the document the Reynolds had presented. The apartment door opened without a knock. Only Sarah had that privilege. She entered carrying bags of Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, taking in the scene of Harold and me surrounded by legal documents and financial statements. I figured you'd need sustenance, she said, unpacking containers of lo mein and orange chicken. And probably someone to talk you out of any middle-of-the-night revenge fantasies. Too late for that, I said, showing her our counter-proposal. Sarah read through it while eating directly from a takeout container, her expression shifting from concern to admiration. This is brilliant. You're not just defending, you're going on offense. The best defense always is, Harold said, accepting a plate of food from Sarah with grandfatherly appreciation. Are you really prepared to reveal everything? Sarah asked me. The inheritance, the company valuation, all of it? Once that's out, you can't put it back. I'd been grappling with that question all evening. For years I'd found safety in financial anonymity, in being valued for myself rather than my net worth. But the Reynolds had forced this choice. They tried to financially destroy me because they thought I was powerless, I said. They need to understand exactly who they attempted to manipulate. Sarah squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you. Most people would have either signed out of fear or exploded in anger. You're doing neither. You're being strategic. Grandma Rose would approve, I said, thinking of how my grandmother had quietly built her fortune while everyone assumed she was just a frugal old woman. Harold began packing his briefcase. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be intense. The Reynolds won't take this counterattack lightly. After he left, Sarah helped me clean up the documentation. Have you heard from Brandon? Nothing. His phone's been off since his parents' visit. That's telling, Sarah said carefully. I know. The silence from Brandon felt like another betrayal. Either he knew about the ambush and was complicit, or he was too weak to check on me after his parents' attack. Neither option promised much for our future. Sarah stayed until almost 2 in the morning, her presence a comfort as doubt and anger battled for dominance in my mind. Before she left, she hugged me tightly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you're doing the right thing. Don't let anyone make you small just to make themselves feel big." I couldn't sleep after she left. Instead, I sat at my laptop crafting the message I would send Brandon at dawn. It needed to be carefully worded, cold enough to convey my anger, vague enough to reveal nothing of my plans. I wanted to see his genuine reaction, not a performance coached by his parents. At 5:47 a.m. I sent the text, "Giovanni's. Noon. We need to talk." His response came quickly, suggesting he hadn't been sleeping either. Of course. "Is everything okay?" I didn't respond. Let him wonder. Let him worry. In 6 hours, I would know whether the man I'd planned to marry would stand with me or fold under his family's pressure. The prenuptial agreement and financial statements sat in my briefcase by the door, waiting. The counterattack was prepared. Now I just needed to know if I'd be deploying it against 3 people or 2. The morning crawled by in agonizing increments. I showered, dressed carefully in a navy dress that projected confidence without ostentation, and arrived at Giovanni's 15 minutes early. The restaurant held countless memories of Brandon and me sharing plates of pasta and dreams for our future. Now it would host either reconciliation or the final fracture of everything we had built together. I chose a corner table where I could see the entrance, ordered sparkling water and waited. My briefcase sat beside me, containing the financial documents and new prenuptial agreement that would either salvage or sink my relationship. The lunch crowd began filtering in, the comfortable noise of conversation and clinking silverware a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. Brandon arrived at exactly noon and my breath caught at his appearance. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, dark circles carved beneath his eyes like bruises. He looked like he had aged 5 years overnight. When he spotted me, something desperate flickered across his face before he composed himself and walked over. He sat down heavily, not even attempting his usual kiss on my cheek. "Elara, before you say anything, I need you to know that I had no idea what my parents were planning. When I got home last night and they told me what they'd done, I completely lost it. We had the worst fight we've ever had. Yet you were conveniently in depositions yesterday evening," I said, keeping my voice level. "Depositions that sounded remarkably like a restaurant when Jennifer answered your phone." His face crumpled. "They told me it was important I stay away. That this was family business that needed to be handled delicately. I thought they were going to discuss wedding logistics with you, maybe go over some family traditions. I never imagined they would ambush you with a prenuptial agreement, especially not one that aggressive. But you knew they wanted a prenup." "Yes," he admitted, his shoulders sagging. "They've been pushing for one since we got engaged. I kept telling them I would handle it, that we would discuss it together like adults. I wanted to wait until after the wedding, deal with it calmly without all this pressure. They agreed, or at least I thought they did." The waiter approached, but I waved him away. This conversation couldn't afford interruptions. "They threatened to disinherit me," Brandon continued, his voice raw. "Not just from the trust fund but from the family entirely. Cut me off from the firm, from everything. And you know what? I told them to do it. I told them if forcing you to sign that document was the price of their money, they could keep every cent." He reached across the table for my hand, but I pulled back. "Not yet. There was too much to reveal first. Brandon, I need to show you something." I pulled out my phone and navigated to my investment portfolio summary, then slid it across the table. He looked at the screen, confusion clouding his features. Then his eyes focused on the numbers and I watched the color drain from his already pale face. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked from the phone to me and back to the phone. "This can't be. $7 million? $7 million. $7.3 million in liquid investments. Another $1.5 million in my company valuation. About $800,000 in rental properties. My grandmother left me more than memories when she died." Brandon stared at the screen like it might transform into something that made more sense. "You've had nearly $10 million this entire time? While my mother made snide comments about your apartment. While my father interrogated you about your financial stability. While they treated you like some fortune hunter trying to marry up. Every condescending smile. Every patronizing comment about my little company. every suggestion that I was lucky to be marrying into the Reynolds family. I let the weight of it settle between us. I sat through it all, knowing I could buy my way into their precious country club 10 times over. His hand trembled as he pushed my phone back across the table. Why didn't you tell me? 3 years, Alara. We've been together 3 years. For the same reason you don't introduce yourself by mentioning your trust fund. I wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I have. I wanted something real, something that wasn't about money or status or family names. I thought we had that. Brandon was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. When he looked up, his expression had shifted to something I hadn't expected. A mixture of awe and understanding, maybe even pride. You let them show exactly who they are, he said slowly. My parents, with all their talk about breeding and class and proper backgrounds. They showed you their worst selves because they thought you were powerless. And the whole time you had more liquid assets than I do. A laugh escaped him, bitter and sharp. Do you know what the irony is? They've been so worried about protecting the family money from you, and you could have been protecting your money from us. God, when they find out. They're going to find out this afternoon, I said, pulling the new prenuptial agreement from my briefcase. Harold Winters and I drafted this last night. It's fair, balanced, protects both parties equally, including protection for my assets and intellectual property. Brandon took the document, scanning through it with his lawyer's eye. I watched him read, seeing his expression shift from professional assessment to genuine surprise. This is completely reasonable. More than reasonable. It's generous, considering what you're bringing to the marriage. He looked up at me. This makes their document look like what it is, a financial assault. The question is, Brandon, where do you stand? Because at 3 o'clock today, I'm meeting with your parents at the Metropolitan Club. I'm going to present this counteroffer and reveal exactly who they tried to intimidate. But I need to know, are you standing with me or between us? He set down the document and leaned forward, his eyes intense. Alara, I need you to understand something. I've spent 30 years under their control. 30 years of being managed, directed, shaped into their vision of what a Reynolds heir should be. Every major decision, every relationship, every choice has been filtered through their approval. Even loving you, became something they had to control and contain. His voice grew stronger. But what they did yesterday, what they tried to do to you, it finally broke something in me. Or maybe it fixed something that had been broken all along. I don't want their money if it comes with strings that strangle everyone I love. I don't want their approval if it means treating people like acquisitions to be managed. He reached for my hand again, and this time I let him take it. I'm not standing between you and them. I'm standing with you, facing them. As equals. As partners. The way it always should have been. The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. You understand what this means. They might actually follow through on their threats. The disinheritance, the firm, all of it. Then I'll build my own career. With someone who sees me as more than just the Reynolds name. His grip tightened on my hand. Tell me the plan. What happens at 3 o'clock? I outlined Harold's strategy, present the counteroffer, reveal my financial position, establish new boundaries for our marriage and their involvement in it. Brandon listened, occasionally nodding, his expression hardening with resolve. They're going to be blindsided, he said. Mother especially. She's built her entire perception of you on the assumption that you need us more than we need you. The Metropolitan Club, 3 o'clock. Harold will be there as my legal representation. Are you prepared for this? Brandon's jaw set with determination I'd rarely seen from him. They've controlled me my whole life, Alara. Used money and family obligation like a leash. It ends today. We left Giovanni's separately, Brandon heading home to change into his best suit while I returned to my apartment to gather the documents and steel myself for what was coming. Harold was already waiting in the Metropolitan Club's lobby when I arrived at 2:45, his presence commanding respect from the staff who clearly recognized legal authority when they saw it. Ready for battle? He asked quietly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. As ready as anyone can be for destroying their in-laws' superiority complex, I replied, clutching my briefcase. The Metropolitan Club was old Chicago money condensed into architecture, dark wood paneling, leather chairs that had held powerful men for generations, oil paintings of long-dead industrialists watching from gilded frames. I had chosen it specifically because here the Reynolds name was just one among many. They couldn't throw their weight around as easily as they could at their own country club. Brandon arrived at 2:55, looking transformed from the broken man at lunch. His charcoal suit was pressed to perfection, his posture straight, his expression set with determination I had rarely seen. He kissed my cheek and whispered, "Together," before taking his seat beside me. We arranged ourselves strategically at the private dining room's table. Harold on my right, Brandon on my left, our documents organized before us like ammunition. The unified front we presented was deliberate. This wasn't a family discussion but a business negotiation. At 3:15 Samuel and Rebecca Reynolds arrived. 15 minutes late, their standard power play to establish dominance. They swept in expecting to find me anxious, checking my watch, worried about their displeasure. Instead they found us deep in discussion about one of the contract clauses, barely glancing up to acknowledge their arrival. "We don't have much time," Samuel announced, pulling out a chair with unnecessary force. "The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow evening and this needs to be resolved." Rebecca sat beside him, her Chanel jacket pristine, her expression already radiating disapproval. "I assume you've come to your senses, Alara. The wedding is tomorrow. Surely you don't want to create unnecessary drama." I looked up from the document I'd been reviewing with Harold, meeting her gaze steadily. "There won't be any drama if we can reach a reasonable agreement." "The agreement was already presented," Samuel said, his tone brooking no argument. "You simply need to sign it." "Actually," I said, sliding our counterproposal across the table, "we're here to discuss terms. Your document was unacceptable. This is our alternative." Rebecca's face flushed. "This isn't a negotiation. You sign our agreement or what?" Brandon's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You'll cancel the wedding? Go ahead, mother. I'll personally call every guest tonight and explain exactly why, that my parents tried to financially abuse my fiancé 2 days before our wedding." The shock on their faces was profound. Rebecca actually recoiled as if Brandon had physically struck her. Samuel's mouth opened but no words emerged. They had never in 30 years heard their son speak to them with such authority. "Brandon," Rebecca began, her voice trembling slightly, "you don't understand the implications." "I understand perfectly," Brandon interrupted. "You ambushed Alara in her own home. You tried to force her to sign away her rights without legal counsel. You attempted to establish financial control over our marriage before it even began. I understand exactly what you did." Samuel recovered first, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "This is about protecting family assets, nothing more." "Then you should be relieved to know that Alara has significant assets of her own to protect," Harold interjected smoothly. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the financial statements, placing them on the polished table with deliberate precision. The documents landed with a soft sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Before you dismiss our counterproposal," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "there's something you should know about who you've been trying to intimidate." Samuel reached for the papers with the confidence of someone used to reviewing financial documents. That confidence evaporated as his eyes scanned the first page. His hand actually trembled as he turned to the second page, then the third. Rebecca leaned over, trying to read over his shoulder, her perfectly composed face cracking like fine china. "This is..." Samuel started, then stopped, then started again. "This can't be accurate." "Every cent documented and verified," Harold said with satisfaction. "Investment accounts, property holdings, company valuation. Ms. Vance's net worth is approximately $10 million. Has been for the entire duration of her relationship with your son." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, a first in my experience with her. She looked from the documents to me, to Brandon, and back to the documents, as if hoping they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense in her worldview. $7 million in inherited wealth," I said calmly. "Another $1.5 million in my technology company that you dismissed as a hobby. $800,000 in rental properties. All mine before I ever met Brandon." The silence stretched so long I could hear the antique clock ticking on the mantel. Samuel set down the documents with exaggerated care as if they might explode. His face had gone from red to pale to an unhealthy gray. "You've had $10 million, Rebecca finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "This entire time. While you treated me like a gold digger," I finished for her. While you made snide comments about my apartment and my car. While you interrogated me about my parents' teaching salaries and assumed I couldn't afford a proper wedding dress. Yes, I had $10 million through all of that. Rebecca's hands fluttered to her throat, fingering her pearl necklace nervously. You could have told us. We would have. Treated me differently? I cut her off. That's exactly why I didn't tell you. I wanted to see who you really were, how you treat people you perceive as beneath you. And now I know. This changes things, Samuel said slowly, his mind clearly recalculating every interaction we'd ever had. No, Brandon said firmly. It doesn't change anything. It only reveals what was always true, that you judged Alara based on your assumptions, not on who she actually is. The money doesn't make her more worthy of respect. It just exposes how unworthy your disrespect always was. Rebecca looked at her son as if seeing him for the first time. Brandon, we were trying to protect you. From what? From marrying a successful, independently wealthy woman who loved me without knowing about my trust fund? Yes, what a terrible fate you were saving me from. Harold cleared his throat. Perhaps we should focus on the matter at hand. The counterproposal Ms. Vance and I have prepared is eminently fair. It protects both parties' assets equally, includes provisions for intellectual property, and establishes clear boundaries for family involvement in marital decisions. Samuel picked up our prenuptial agreement, his movements mechanical. He began reading, his professional instincts taking over despite his obvious shock. Rebecca sat frozen, staring at me as if I had transformed into someone else entirely. The power dynamic in the room had completely reversed. The people who had walked in expecting submission were now faced with equals. No, with people who had outmaneuvered them completely. Their carefully constructed ambush had become their own humiliation. Samuel set down our prenuptial agreement after reading it through twice, his expression unreadable. Rebecca remained frozen, her fingers still clutching her pearls as if they were a lifeline to the world she understood. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt like hours. This agreement, Samuel finally said, his voice measured and professional, is actually more favorable to Brandon than what we proposed was to Alara. That's the point, Harold responded. A marriage is a partnership, not a hostile takeover. Samuel's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone and stepped away from the table, speaking in hushed tones to someone, undoubtedly his legal team. Rebecca watched her husband with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Uncertainty. I need some air, she announced suddenly, standing with less than her usual grace. She walked to the window overlooking Michigan Avenue, her back to us, shoulders rigid beneath her designer jacket. Brandon reached for my hand under the table. His palm was steady, warm, reassuring. We waited in silence while Samuel conducted 3 separate phone calls, each one apparently more heated than the last. I caught fragments. No, that's not acceptable. And find another way, and finally, I don't care what Thompson thinks. After 20 minutes, Samuel returned to the table. My legal team wants to make several modifications. No modifications, Harold said simply. The agreement is more than fair. Sign it as written or we walk away. You're giving us an ultimatum? Samuel's voice carried a note of disbelief, as if the universe had suddenly inverted. The same ultimatum you gave Alara, Brandon said quietly. Except we're giving you 18 hours to decide, not 2. Rebecca turned from the window. Her face had lost its usual careful composure, revealing something raw underneath. Why? She asked, looking directly at me. Why did you hide this from us? The question hung in the air. I could have given her the easy answer, that it was none of their business, that my finances were private. But something in her expression, a crack in the facade she'd maintained for 3 years, made me choose honesty. My grandmother lived her entire life being judged for not having enough, I said. She was brilliant, strategic, patient, and everyone dismissed her as just another working-class woman who clipped coupons. When she left me her fortune, she also left me a lesson. Money doesn't reveal character, it conceals it. People show you who they really are when they think you have nothing they want. Rebecca flinched as if I'd slapped her. She returned to her seat slowly, aging years in those few steps. We'll need time to review this properly, Samuel said, though his tone had lost its earlier authority. You have until noon tomorrow, Harold replied. The wedding is at 4. That should be sufficient time for a decision. We left them sitting at that polished table, their world reshuffled like a deck of cards. In the elevator, Brandon pulled me into his arms, holding me tight enough that I could feel his heart racing. "You were magnificent," he whispered against my hair. That evening, Harold called me 3 times with updates. The Reynolds legal team had attempted to negotiate modifications to our terms. Each time, Harold had responded with the same message. "The agreement stands as written. Sign or cancel." Brandon spent the night at his apartment. We'd decided to honor at least that tradition. But he called me at midnight, his voice exhausted. "They're fighting," he said. "I can hear them from my old room. Mom's accusing Dad of failing to do proper due diligence. Dad's blaming her for making assumptions based on appearances. They've been at it for hours." "Are you okay?" I asked, knowing how hard it must be to hear his parents unraveling. "Actually, yes," he said, and I could hear surprise in his voice. "For the first time in my life, their anger isn't my problem to fix. Their assumptions aren't my burden to manage. It's liberating." I barely slept that night, alternating between confidence in our position and anxiety about what morning would bring. Sarah stayed with me, making tea and offering distractions, but we both knew there was nothing to do but wait. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, my wedding day, the doorbell rang. A courier stood outside with an envelope bearing the Reynolds family crest. My hands trembled slightly as I signed for it and closed the door. Inside was our prenuptial agreement, signed by both Samuel and Rebecca Reynolds, properly witnessed and notarized. A handwritten note was clipped to the front, written in Samuel's precise script. "Ms. Vance, or should I say soon to be Mrs. Reynolds, you have proven yourself more formidable than we anticipated. Perhaps that is exactly what Brandon needs and what this family needs. We look forward to welcoming you properly. Samuel Reynolds." There was no note from Rebecca. Her signature on the document was the only communication she'd offered. Surrender delivered in elegant cursive. Sarah read the note over my shoulder and laughed. "Look forward to welcoming you properly? After 3 years of treating you like dirt." But I understood what the note really meant. It was an admission of defeat, yes, but also a recognition of equality. I had forced them to see me not as the woman they'd imagined, but as the woman I actually was. 3 hours later, as my mother helped me into my wedding dress and Sarah fixed my veil, there was a knock at the bridal suite door. My father answered it, and I heard Rebecca's voice, softer than I'd ever heard it. "Might I have a moment with Alara?" My mother and Sarah exchanged glances, but I nodded. They stepped out, leaving Rebecca and me alone for the first time since the ambush in my apartment. She carried a small velvet jewelry box, holding it with unusual hesitancy. Gone was the armor of designer clothing and imperial bearing. She looked vulnerable, almost fragile. "These belonged to Samuel's grandmother," she said, opening the box to reveal antique sapphire earrings, their blue depths catching the light. "Margaret Reynolds. She was a seamstress who married Samuel's grandfather in 1921, against every family objection. They called her a fortune hunter, said she'd trapped him. During the Depression, when the family business was failing, she sold her jewelry, all except these, and used her savings from years of sewing to keep the company afloat. She saved the Reynolds legacy." Rebecca held out the box to me. "She would have appreciated you, I think. Someone who understands that true worth isn't always visible on the surface." It was the closest to an apology I would ever receive from Rebecca Reynolds, and somehow it was enough. I took the earrings, removing the simple pearls I'd planned to wear and replacing them with Margaret Reynolds sapphires. "Thank you," I said simply. Rebecca nodded, straightening her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "I should go. But Alara," she paused at the door, "welcome to the family. Truly this time." The door closed softly behind Rebecca, leaving me alone with my reflection in the bridal suite mirror. The sapphire earrings caught the afternoon light, their blue depths holding decades of history. A seamstress who had saved an empire, now passing her strength to another woman who refused to be diminished. Sarah and my mother returned, their faces curious but respectful of whatever had just transpired between Rebecca and me. "Ready to get married?" Sarah asked, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my dress. "More than ready," I said and meant it. The battle had been won before the ceremony even began. Walking down the aisle of the Drake Hotel's ballroom, I noticed everything had shifted. The guests who had previously looked through me now watched with keen interest. Samuel stood with the groomsmen, his nod of acknowledgement carrying genuine respect. Rebecca sat in the front row, her hands folded carefully in her lap, wearing an expression I'd never seen before, something approaching humility. Brandon waited at the altar, his face transformed with an emotion that took my breath away. Not just love but liberation. We had both been freed by truth and now we could build something real on that foundation. The ceremony passed in a blur of traditional vows that carried new meaning. When Brandon promised to honor and cherish me, his voice carried the weight of someone who had already proven those words. When I promised to stand by him in good times and bad, we both knew I already had. At the reception, the real transformation revealed itself. During cocktail hour, Samuel approached me while Brandon was talking with his law school friends. He carried 2 glasses of champagne, offering one with an expression of genuine curiosity rather than his usual calculated assessment. "I've been reviewing your investment portfolio structure," he said without preamble. "The diversification strategy is impressive. Did your grandmother design it or have you modified it?" "Both," I replied, accepting the champagne. "She built the foundation, but I've adjusted based on market conditions and emerging sectors. Technology, particularly educational technology, is undervalued right now." Samuel leaned in, his voice dropping. "I have a client looking to invest in that sector. Would you be willing to discuss your insights? Not now, of course, but perhaps lunch next week." The man who had tried to financially dominate me 48 hours ago was now seeking my expertise. The reversal was so complete it felt surreal. "I'll have my assistant call yours," I said, matching his professional tone. During the dinner service, Rebecca performed her own transformation. The governor's wife had approached our table to offer congratulations, and Rebecca stood, placing her hand on my shoulder with surprising warmth. "Mrs. Morrison, let me introduce you to my daughter-in-law, Ilara. She's the brilliant entrepreneur behind EDU Tech Solutions. You know, the company that just won the state contract for adaptive learning software." The pride in her voice was genuine. Mrs. Morrison engaged me in a 20-minute discussion about education reform while Rebecca watched with something approaching maternal satisfaction. "Your mother-in-law speaks very highly of you," Mrs. Morrison said as she prepared to return to her table. "She called you a hidden gem that the Reynolds family was fortunate to discover." Later, during the traditional family photos, Brandon's extended relatives treated me with a deference that had nothing to do with warm feelings and everything to do with the rapid recalculation of my worth. His cousin James, who had previously ignored me at family gatherings, suddenly wanted to discuss potential collaboration between his digital marketing firm and my company. "Maybe we can talk after your honeymoon," I said politely, having no intention of following through. The most meaningful moment came during our first dance. Brandon held me close as the band played our song, his breath warm against my ear. "You didn't just beat them," he whispered. "You freed me too. 30 years, Ilara. 30 years of being managed, controlled, directed. Every decision filtered through their approval, every choice measured against their expectations." He pulled back slightly to look at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I spent my whole life accepting that their money came with chains. You showed me the chains were only as strong as my fear of losing their approval. You showed me it was possible to stand up to them and survive." "We showed each other," I corrected, thinking of how his support had made my revelation possible. "I couldn't have done this without you choosing to stand with me." As we swayed together, I caught glimpses of our guests over Brandon's shoulder. Harold Winters raised his champagne glass in a silent toast, his expression satisfied. Sarah was crying happy tears while pretending to fix her makeup. My parents danced nearby, my father giving me a proud wink when our eyes met. 6 months have passed since that wedding day and the changes have held firm. Our prenuptial agreement remains untouched in the bank's safe deposit box, its purpose already served, not as protection against divorce but as the document that established our equality. Rebecca calls before visiting now, actually asking rather than announcing. "Would Tuesday work for lunch?" she'll say, respecting when I respond that I have client meetings. The woman who once invaded every boundary now waits for invitation. Samuel regularly forwards me investment opportunities, genuinely seeking my opinion. His emails come with notes like, "Thought this might interest you," or "Would value your perspective on this." The condescension has been replaced with collegial respect. Sunday dinners with the Reynolds family happen monthly now, not weekly. We established that boundary early and surprisingly they've respected it. When we do attend, the dynamic has completely shifted. Rebecca asks about my company with genuine interest. Samuel discusses market trends as equals. Even Brandon's siblings treat me as a peer rather than an interloper. Our home, a Lincoln Park townhouse we purchased together, both names on the deed, has become a symbol of our balanced partnership. Neither the modest apartment I'd clung to nor the ostentatious mansion his parents would have chosen, but something that reflects both of us. Sometimes I stand in my home office, looking at the photo of Grandma Rose on my bookshelf and feel her presence. She lived her entire life letting people underestimate her while quietly building an empire. She taught me that true wealth isn't what you display but how you deploy it when it matters most. The Reynolds learned that lesson the hard way. They thought they were ambushing a powerless girl who needed their son more than he needed her. Instead, they encountered someone who had spent years studying their playbook while hiding her own cards. My revenge wasn't destroying them, it was forcing them to see me clearly for the first time. The prenuptial agreement they'd wielded as a weapon became the mirror that reflected their own assumptions back at them. Their contemptuous grins had been aimed at someone far more formidable than they'd ever imagined, and in the end, they had no choice but to acknowledge it. The treasures that hide in plain sight are often the most valuable, and the opponents you never see coming are the most dangerous of all. If this story of turning the tables on entitled in-laws had you cheering for justice, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Alara placed those financial statements on the table and watched the Reynolds family's superiority complex crumble in seconds. What was your favorite moment of sweet revenge? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.